They looked like the perfect family. Big house, rich lifestyle, quiet streets, two sons who smiled in photos, parents who dressed well and hosted parties. But what lived behind those walls wasn't peace. It was pressure, control, fear. Lyle and Eric Menendez were born into wealth, but not comfort. Their father, Jose Menendez, was a powerful man. He had come from Cuba with nothing and built himself into a Hollywood executive. He demanded success. He expected obedience. He controlled everything. What they wore, how they talked, what they did. Love didn't feel like love. It felt like power. Their mother, Kitty, once had dreams, but over the years she faded. She drank more. She cried in private. She lived in a house filled with silence. Her pain didn't leave bruises, but it left marks. Lyle was the older one, outgoing, confident, but restless. He clashed with rules. He wanted approval, but never felt good enough. Eric was quiet, soft-spoken. He loved to write. He felt things deeply. He looked up to his brother, but carried secrets even Lyle didn't fully know. Their childhood looked fine from the outside. Private schools, tennis practice, family vacations, but inside the house, behind locked doors, things were happening no child should ever experience. Things that wouldn't be spoken aloud until years later in front of a jury. They lived under control, under threat, under shame. Jose wasn't just strict, he was cruel. The kind of cruelty that hides behind closed doors and smiles in public. For years, they stayed quiet. They did what they were told. They played the part, but something was changing. Eric grew more anxious. He started writing things down. His fears, his confusion. Lyle started talking back, failing classes, acting out. The pressure kept building. They tried to escape. Lyle got into Princeton, but he got suspended. Eric tried focusing on tennis, but it wasn't enough. Their father was angry, disappointed. Their mother withdrew even more, and still no one asked what was really happening. Until one night, it all exploded. August 20, 1989. A quiet Sunday in Beverly Hills. No signs of trouble, no warning, but something inside the brothers had broken. Something that had been breaking for years. That night, while their parents watched television in the den, Lyle and Eric entered the room with two shotguns. They didn't just shoot, they unleashed years of pain, years of silence. Their father was hit first, then their mother. The scene was brutal, 11 shots in total, the kind of violence that comes from deep fear, not cold planning. They left the house, they got rid of the guns, then they came back and called 911. Eric's voice on the call was panicked, screaming, "Someone killed my parents." The police arrived, no forced entry, no stolen items, just death, and two sons crying in the driveway. At first, the police believed them. Why wouldn't they? Rich boys, grieving, no record, no motive. The detectives asked questions, the brothers cried, and the case stayed quiet. But something didn't sit right. Why were they calm the next day? Why were they spending money, buying Rolex watches, cars, expensive meals? In the weeks that followed, they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some called it grief, others called it guilt. The investigation dragged on. The media didn't know yet. The police kept watching. Then, one day, Eric broke. He confessed to his therapist. The therapist told someone else. And just like that, the secret was out. The brothers were arrested in 1990, and the story exploded. The arrest came quietly, but the impact was loud. Two well-dressed, well-known boys from Beverly Hills taken in for murdering their own parents. The country froze. People couldn't understand it. Why would they do it? Why would two sons from privilege kill the very people who gave them everything? The answer, as it turned out, would shake the idea of the perfect family to its core. At first, prosecutors saw it as greed. Two spoiled kids who didn't want to wait for inheritance. They pointed to the money, the shopping, the new cars, the vacations. They said the boys wanted freedom, money without rules, power without obedience. But the defense had a different story. They didn't talk about money, they talked about trauma. They said the brothers had lived in a prison for years. A beautiful, expensive prison. One where the guards wore suits and smiled for the camera. Behind closed doors, they claimed, things happened that would destroy any child. The court heard things no one wanted to believe. Eric, the younger one, cried as he spoke. He told the court what he remembered. what he had kept buried, what had made him feel dirty, helpless, ashamed. Lyle sat beside him, sometimes crying, sometimes staring into space, like he was watching it all happen again in his head. They said their father abused them, not just with words, not just with anger, but in ways that twisted their sense of safety, that blurred the line between discipline and violation. They said he touched them, controlled them, broke them. They said their mother knew, and she did nothing. Sometimes, they claimed, she looked away. Sometimes she drank. Sometimes she blamed them. But she never stopped it, never protected them. She stayed quiet, and so did they. For years. The jury listened. The media exploded. Some people believed the brothers. Others called it an act. Said they were lying to save themselves, that the abuse story was a defense trick, that it didn't excuse murder. But the courtroom wasn't a TV screen. It was real. The witnesses cried. The experts talked about trauma, about cycles of fear, about the way abuse can shape a mind. The prosecution argued motive. The defense argued survival. This wasn't about innocence. This was about understanding. Could someone commit murder and still be a victim? Could two sons raised in fear ever feel free unless they ended what they feared most? This is the first case guy weigh the both thing and down were themselves. The case dragged on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The country watched. The brothers sat quietly in court, no longer in designer clothes, no longer shielded by money or reputation. Just two young men, accused of something unthinkable, trying to explain what no child should ever have to live through. And then came the tapes. Tapes from their therapist, secret recordings, words they thought were private. Eric had confessed. He'd told the truth. But now, that truth was evidence. It changed everything. The jury was split. Some believed them, others didn't. One trial ended without a verdict. Another was ordered. Two trials, two juries, two stories, but only one truth. And it wasn't simple, because sometimes pain doesn't make sense. Sometimes people who are hurt others. Sometimes the ones you expect to love you the most are the ones who destroy you from the inside. The Menendez case wasn't just about murder. It was about silence. It was about what happens when no one listens, when no one speaks, when a family looks perfect but is dying behind the curtains. In the end, the law had to decide, not just who pulled the trigger, but why. The second trial was different, more controlled, more focused. The judge limited what the jury could hear. No cameras this time, no emotional testimonies broadcast across every living room. The goal now was clarity, simplicity, law over drama. But how do you make something like this simple? Two brothers, two parents, one crime, but 1,000 tangled emotions underneath. The prosecution didn't want to talk about abuse this time. They wanted motive. They pointed again to the money, the new lifestyle after the murders. Lyle buying watches, Eric hiring a tennis coach, expensive restaurants, private shopping trips. They said that's what mattered. Not pain, not fear, just greed. But the defense still remembered what the boys had said, what they had lived. They weren't perfect, but they weren't monsters either. They were boys who had lived in a kind of war. And one day, the war became too much. The jury didn't know what to do with that. People outside had already chosen sides. Some saw them as victims. Others saw them as cold-blooded killers. The country was divided, and it showed. Talk shows, news specials, tabloids, magazines. The Menendez brothers became symbols, for some, of a broken justice system, for others of the pain that lives in silence. Inside the courtroom, they were just defendants. But outside, they had become something more, something complicated. People argued about what should matter more, the past or the present, the truth or the law, the facts or the feeling. The brothers didn't speak much now. They sat quietly, letting the system speak for them. Their eyes looked different, tired, older. By now, it had been years since the murders. But trauma doesn't follow time. It lingers. It stains everything. And it doesn't go away when the cameras do. The second trial ended with a verdict. Guilty. Both brothers, first-degree murder, no parole, life in prison. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't cry. It just stopped. Quietly. As if something heavy had finally fallen and no one knew what to say. Outside, reactions were instant. Some felt relief, others felt rage. Some said justice was done, others said justice had been blind. But for Lyle and Eric, the story didn't end with the verdict. Because prison is not the end, it's a new beginning. And for them, it was the beginning of something strange, a kind of awakening. They were no longer hiding, no longer trying to pretend. In prison, they began to speak more, to write, to reflect, not because they were trying to escape the sentence, but because they were finally free in a way they never were at home. No more lies, no more secrets, no more pretending the past didn't happen. They were behind bars, but they could finally breathe. Prison changed them, not in the way people expect, not through violence or loneliness or regret. It changed them by giving them something they never had before: stillness. No more pretending, no more hiding. For the first time, they were no longer part of a family they feared. For the first time, they could begin to understand who they were without looking over their shoulders. Lyle, always the louder one, became quiet. He wrote letters. He read books. He took college classes. He started helping other inmates who couldn't read or write. He became a kind of mentor, not because anyone asked him to, but because he needed purpose. Eric, always the more emotional one, kept a diary. He talked about the past, about the moments that haunted him. He played basketball with other inmates. He spent hours in silence, thinking, remembering, letting himself feel things he never could before. They were separated, different prisons, different lives, but they kept in touch through letters, long letters, pages filled with apologies, memories, hope. They wrote not just to each other, but to people outside, supporters, strangers, sometimes even critics. They answered questions. They listened. They explained. Over time, a strange thing began to happen. People started listening back. At first, it was small. Letters from people who had also lived through abuse. Survivors who understood the shame, the silence, the fear. Then came podcasts, articles, discussions online. New generations were hearing the story for the first time, and they didn't see it the way people had in the 90s. They didn't just see spoiled kids with money. They saw boys who were trapped, who were hurt, who broke under pressure too big to carry. Eric and Lyle never denied what they did. They never asked to be released. They never said it was right. They just wanted people to know why. To understand the pain behind the act. To understand the nights spent crying behind locked doors. The years of being afraid to speak. The helplessness of children who trusted the wrong people to protect them. Some people believed them. Others still called them murderers. But slowly the conversation began to shift. Not just about them, but about trauma. About how childhood abuse shapes the brain. About how victims don't always look like victims. About how sometimes silence can become a weapon. In prison, they found pieces of themselves. Lyle got married twice. His second wife stayed. They talked on the phone every day. She said he was kind, thoughtful, steady. Eric got married too. A pen pal who became a friend, then something more. She said he made her feel seen. These relationships weren't built on fairy tales. They were built on truth, on long talks, on honesty, on understanding what it means to live with the worst thing you've ever done and still try to be human. Meanwhile, outside the walls, their story refused to die. New documentaries were made. New evidence was reviewed. People wondered if the trial had happened today with what we now know about abuse, about mental health, about trauma, would the outcome have been the same? It's hard to say. Justice doesn't always move with time. But stories do, and their story, as painful as it is, has become something bigger than two boys in a courtroom. It has become a mirror. A mirror for how families can fail, how appearances can lie, how silence can kill more slowly than violence, and how sometimes, even behind prison walls, people can begin again, not with freedom, but with truth. Years passed, decades. The Menendez brothers stayed in prison, their story buried under new headlines, newer crimes, louder names. But some stories don't stay buried, not when they carry questions that never really got answered. Not when a generation grows up in a world more willing to listen than to judge. In the age of social media, the story came alive again. Clips from old interviews, testimony from the trials, the 911 call, footage of the boys crying in court. Young people began watching, rewatching, talking. And what they saw was different from what their parents had seen years ago. They didn't see monsters. They saw boys. Scared, broken boys who had done something unforgivable, and maybe, just maybe, understandable. On TikTok, on YouTube, on Reddit, thousands of people began revisiting the case. They dug deep, analyzed court transcripts, questioned the way the legal system had treated trauma in the 1990s. They asked hard questions. Was it really just about money? Why would rich kids risk everything if they had any other way out? Why did the second trial exclude most of the abuse evidence? Support grew, slowly, then all at once. Not for release, not for forgiveness, but for recognition. Recognition that abuse can destroy people in invisible ways, that trauma can make you act in desperation, that children, especially boys, are often taught to hide pain until it explodes. Petitions started, letters to officials, renewed calls for clemency. Some wanted their case reopened. Others just wanted the world to stop calling them spoiled murderers. All wanted one thing: truth. By now, Lyle and Eric were no longer young men. They were in their 50s, still writing letters, still speaking when asked, still explaining, with the same tired honesty, what it felt like to live in that house, what it felt like to be trapped in a family that looked perfect, but felt like a prison. Their voices were no longer emotional. They were calm, steady, changed, not just by time, but by the weight of knowing their lives could never be undone. They never asked to be seen as heroes. They only asked to be seen completely. Not just as sons who killed, but as sons who suffered. The media began to shift. Documentaries re-examined the case. Experts on trauma weighed in. Mental health professionals explained how years of abuse could warp a child's view of safety, of escape, of choice. It wasn't about excusing the crime. It was about understanding how it happened. And understanding, for many, felt like justice, or at least part of it. In 2023, new attention brought old evidence back into the spotlight. People who had known the family came forward, former friends, coaches, housekeepers, each offering pieces of a puzzle the courtroom had never fully solved. They spoke of fear, of strange rules, of a house that never felt safe, of two boys who changed slowly, then all at once. It wasn't enough to change the sentence, but it changed something else, the story. The Menendez brothers weren't just a headline anymore. They became part of a national conversation about abuse, trauma, masculinity, silence, about how society sees victims when they fight back, about how systems often protect power, not people. And through it all, the brothers remained behind bars. No parole, no freedom, just words. Words that now reach more people than they ever had before. Letters that reminded the world that even behind prison walls, someone can still grow, still reflect, still try to make peace with a past that can never be erased. Because some stories don't end with a verdict. They keep echoing. As long as someone is still listening, they live in separate prisons, miles apart, unable to see each other. But they remain connected through memory, through letters, through a bond that began not with blood, but with survival. Lyle and Eric Menendez were once just two boys from Beverly Hills, born into wealth, raised under palm trees, sent to good schools, photographed in sweaters and slacks, looking like sons of the American dream. But what no one could see in those photos was the truth behind the frame. The late nights filled with shouting, the rules that shifted without warning, the fear of footsteps in the hallway, the silence they were forced to keep, the shame that grew in secret. When they finally broke that silence, it was with gunfire, and the world judged them only for that sound, not for the years of quiet that led up to it, not for the hundreds of moments they flinched, not for the nights they cried into pillows, hoping someone, anyone, would notice. That's what makes this story impossible to cleanly understand. Because no matter how much pain they suffered, two people still died. Jose and Kitty Menendez didn't live to tell their side of the story. We only know the version left behind, through court testimony, through photographs, through the pain etched into their sons' voices. Were they monsters or parents who made terrible mistakes? Were they abusers or victims of their own damage? The truth is probably not simple. Few truths are. What we know for certain is this: Two sons were hurt, and in the end, they hurt back, in the most irreversible way, not in self-defense in the legal sense, but in the emotional one, not to escape a moment, but to escape a lifetime. It wasn't right, but it wasn't meaningless either. Now, decades later, the Menendez brothers are still behind bars. But outside those bars, something has changed. People have started asking better questions about what abuse looks like, about how trauma shapes behavior, about how justice handles stories that don't fit neatly into guilt or innocence. Their story became a case study in broken systems, in what happens when no one looks behind the curtain, in what happens when we confuse wealth with safety and silence with peace.